Greetings, my friends, new and old. My name is Sage, and I'm here to guide you through the history and lore behind the wizarding world. Feel free to get cozy and relax, or even fade into deep slumber as we dive into this video's theme, Slytherin's true history. The founding of Hogwarts was not a single moment of inspiration, but a sustained act of collaboration shaped by urgency. Each of the four founders arrived at the idea of a magical school through different experiences, yet all were responding to the same reality. Without structure, the wizarding world would continue to fracture under pressure. Hogwarts was conceived as a refuge, a training ground, and a quiet assertion that magical knowledge could be preserved without inviting destruction. When the founders agreed to create Hogwarts, they did not do so with identical visions of what it should become. Rather, they shared a baseline goal and negotiated everything else. Godric Gryffindor prioritized bravery and moral courage, believing that witches and wizards must be prepared to stand openly against injustice when necessary. Rowena Ravenclaw emphasized disciplined learning, convinced that ignorance, not blood or fear, was the true threat to magical society. Helga Hufflepuff focused on fairness and access, arguing that magic itself imposed an obligation to teach rather than to hoard. Salazar Slytherin entered this collaboration with a complementary but cautious philosophy. He agreed that magical education was essential, but he believed it must be selective and deliberate. In his view, Hogwarts was not merely a place to nurture talent, but a mechanism to protect the wider magical population. Training the wrong students too quickly, or without sufficient grounding, could undo the very safety the school was meant to create. From this tension emerged the house system. Rather than sorting by ability alone, the founders chose to sort by temperament and values. This was not an arbitrary decision. It reflected a belief that magical power expressed itself differently depending on character, and that students would thrive best among peers who shared their approach to the world. Slytherin House, in its original conception, was not designed as an enclave of cruelty or supremacy. It was intended to cultivate leadership, ambition, and strategic thinking. Salazar believed that magical society needed planners as much as heroes, negotiators as much as scholars. His house was meant to produce witches and wizards who could navigate power structures quietly and effectively, ensuring stability behind the scenes. Ambition, in this context, was not equated with domination. It was defined as drive paired with patience. A Slytherin student was expected to see beyond immediate outcomes, to consider long-term consequences, and to pursue goals through adaptability rather than force. These traits mirrored Salazar's own magical philosophy, shaped by concealment and endurance rather than spectacle. The sorting hat itself reflects this nuanced origin. Enchanted collectively by the founders, it was imbued with their values and disagreements alike. While Salazar's influence ensured that lineage and cunning were considered, the hat was never programmed to exclude automatically. It evaluated potential, preference, and temperament, balancing competing priorities rather than enforcing a single ideology. Early Hogwarts records suggest that Slytherin House initially included a broader range of students than later centuries would imply. Blood purity was not yet codified doctrine. What mattered more was preparedness. Students who demonstrated discipline, restraint, and awareness of magical consequences were favoured. These qualities often correlated with magical upbringing, but they were not synonymous with it. As Hogwarts settled into routine, Slytherin House quickly distinguished itself as a training ground for governance. Its students gravitated toward roles involving coordination, strategy, and institutional continuity. They were often drawn to administrative magic, advanced charms, and long-term projects that required careful planning. While other houses produced visible champions, Slytherin students frequently operated behind the scenes. This dynamic complemented the broader Hogwarts ecosystem. Gryffindors took risks, Ravenclaws refined knowledge, Hufflepuffs sustained community, Slytherins maintained structure. In its earliest years, the house system functioned less as competition and more as interdependence. Each house addressed a different vulnerability within magical society. The tensions between Salazar and the other founders did not negate this initial balance. Disagreements were frequent but functional. The school's survival depended on maintaining internal cohesion, even amid philosophical difference. For a time, that cohesion held. What would later be remembered as Slytherin exceptionalism was originally institutional responsibility. Salazar believed that power naturally accumulated somewhere, and that ignoring this reality invited chaos. His house was designed to engage with power directly, rather than pretend it could be dispersed evenly without consequence. It is important to note that early Slytherin students were not isolated from the rest of the school. They shared classes, meals, and communal spaces. House identity existed alongside a broader Hogwarts identity. The later insularity associated with Slytherin developed gradually, influenced by external pressures rather than initial design. In this early period, Hogwarts represented a fragile experiment. It balanced openness with caution, idealism with pragmatism. Slytherin House embodied the pragmatic end of that spectrum, offering a counterweight to optimism that Salazar feared could become recklessness. Understanding the original purpose of Slytherin House requires setting aside later outcomes. It was not built as a breeding ground for extremism, but as a stabilizing force within an unstable world. Its values were shaped by the belief that survival required foresight, discipline, and the willingness to make uncomfortable decisions. As centuries passed, the context that gave these values meaning would change. Safety increased, secrecy improved, threats evolved, but the structure remained, carrying forward assumptions born of a harsher era. The seeds planted at Hogwarts' founding would grow in ways the founders themselves could not fully control. In its original form, Slytherin House was neither villainous nor virtuous. It was necessary, shaped by fear and responsibility in equal measure. To understand its later reputation, one must first understand the role it was meant to play at the beginning. Salazar Slytherin has endured in wizarding history less as a man than as a symbol. His name is spoken as shorthand for prejudice, secrecy, and dark magic, often stripped of context and compressed into a cautionary tale. Over centuries, retellings have simplified him into an antagonist defined solely by what he opposed, rather than by what he sought to preserve. To understand Slytherin House, however, it is necessary to return to Salazar himself, not as a legend shaped by later consequences, but as a living wizard navigating a dangerous world. What little is known of Salazar Slytherin's early life must be reconstructed from fragments, patterns, and the broader conditions of his era. He was born in Britain sometime in the 10th century, during a period when magical and non-magical populations were increasingly hostile toward one another. This was not a peaceful countryside, punctuated by rare incidents of persecution. It was an age defined by suspicion, religious consolidation, and violent enforcement of orthodoxy. Magical families were not merely marginalized, they were hunted. Salazar appears to have been raised within a magical lineage that placed heavy emphasis on discipline, secrecy, and control. While this cannot be confirmed in detail, his later magical proficiency suggests early and rigorous training. He was not an intuitive or impulsive caster. His magic, as preserved in legend and artifact, reflects planning, precision, and foresight. These traits did not emerge spontaneously. They were cultivated. Among Salazar's most defining abilities was Parseltongue, the rare and inherited gift of speaking with serpents. In later centuries, this ability would become synonymous with dark wizards, but during Salazar's lifetime, it functioned primarily as a practical advantage. Serpents were powerful magical creatures, often dangerous and nearly impossible to control. Communication offered mastery where brute force failed. Parseltongue was not inherently malevolent, it was specialized. Salazar's affinity for serpents extended beyond language into symbolism and magical philosophy. Serpents represented patience, vigilance, and latent power. They did not waste energy. They waited. This symbolism aligns closely with the traits later associated with Slytherin House. Strategic thinking, ambition tempered by timing, and the ability to endure quietly until opportunity presented itself. In addition to his serpentine magic, Salazar was known for advanced spellcraft. He was deeply knowledgeable in defensive enchantments, concealment charms, and magical architecture. These were not the glamorous disciplines celebrated in later eras. They were survival arts. His interest in constructing magical spaces that could endure, protect, and remain hidden speaks to a mind oriented toward permanence rather than spectacle. Salazar's relationship with the other founders is often reduced to its ending, but it began in collaboration. Godric Gryffindor was not his enemy, but his friend. Their shared vision for a school suggests mutual respect and complementary strengths. Where Gryffindor valued courage and decisive action, Slytherin valued preparation and foresight. These philosophies were not initially incompatible. Together, they addressed different dimensions of survival. Rowena Ravenclaw recognized Salazar's intellect, even when she disagreed with his conclusions. Her emphasis on wisdom and learning required stability and protection, both of which Salazar prioritized. Helga Hufflepuff, with her focus on inclusion and fairness, balanced his caution with compassion. In the school's earliest days, these differences created tension, but also resilience. Salazar was not isolated in his views during this period. Concerns about uncontrolled magic were widespread. What distinguished him was not the belief that magical education required boundaries, but the degree of restriction he believed necessary. To Salazar, lineage offered a measurable proxy for preparedness. It was imperfect, but in his estimation, safer than openness without safeguards. His insistence on selective admission did not arise from disdain for ability. Muggle-born witches and wizards often demonstrated extraordinary talent. Salazar's concern lay not with their potential, but with the risks imposed upon the broader magical community by admitting students whose upbringing had not included concealment, restraint, and cultural awareness. In an age without secrecy statutes or reliable protection, one child's mistake could expose hundreds. This perspective, while ethically troubling, was not irrational within its historical frame. It was a form of triage. Salazar believed Hogwarts should first secure the survival of magical society before expanding access. His co-founders believed education itself was the path to safety. Both positions emerged from the same fear, interpreted differently. Salazar's eventual estrangement from Hogwarts was not abrupt. It followed prolonged disagreement and failed compromise. The Sorting Hat itself reflects this tension, embodying Salazar's preferences while remaining a shared artifact. Even in departure, his influence remained embedded in the institution's foundations. Crucially, Salazar did not view himself as a villain. He saw himself as a guardian. His actions in his own mind were defensive, not punitive. He believed that magical heritage carried responsibility, and that responsibility demanded difficult choices. History would judge those choices harshly, but it would do so with the benefit of distance and safety he did not possess. After leaving Hogwarts, Salazar fades from reliable record. Legends proliferate where evidence thins. Some claim he retreated into secrecy. Others suggest he continued teaching privately or working on long-term magical projects. What can be said with confidence is that he did not seek public power or conquest. His legacy is institutional rather than imperial. Understanding Salazar Slytherin as a man rather than a myth does not require agreement with his beliefs. It requires recognizing the conditions that shaped them. He was a product of fear, responsibility, and a relentless focus on survival. The tragedy of his story lies not in villainy, but in rigidity. His answers did not evolve as the world slowly changed. Slytherin House inherited both his strengths and his limitations. Ambition, foresight, and resilience endured. So too did suspicion and exclusivity. Over centuries, as danger receded and safety increased, the balance tipped. What began as caution hardened into doctrine. Salazar Slytherin did not create a house of villains. He created a house shaped by the belief that survival must come before idealism. The wizarding world that followed would grapple endlessly with whether that belief had ever truly stopped being necessary. The founding of Hogwarts was not a single moment of inspiration, but a sustained act of collaboration shaped by urgency. Each of the four founders arrived at the idea of a magical school through different experiences, yet all were responding to the same reality. Without structure, the wizarding world would continue to fracture under pressure. Hogwarts was conceived as a refuge, a training ground, and a quiet assertion that magical knowledge could be preserved without inviting destruction. When the founders agreed to create Hogwarts, they did not do so with identical visions of what it should become. Rather, they shared a baseline goal and negotiated everything else. Godric Gryffindor prioritized bravery and moral courage, believing that witches and wizards must be prepared to stand openly against injustice when necessary. Rowena Ravenclaw emphasized disciplined learning, convinced that ignorance, not blood or fear, was the true threat to magical society. Helga Hufflepuff focused on fairness and access, arguing that magic itself imposed an obligation to teach rather than to hoard. Salazar Slytherin entered this collaboration with a complementary but cautious philosophy. He agreed that magical education was essential, but he believed it must be selective and deliberate. In his view, Hogwarts was not merely a place to nurture talent, but a mechanism to protect the wider magical population. Training the wrong students too quickly, or without sufficient grounding, could undo the very safety the school was meant to create. From this tension emerged the house system. Rather than sorting by ability alone, the founders chose to sort by temperament and values. This was not an arbitrary decision. It reflected a belief that magical power expressed itself differently depending on character, and that students would thrive best among peers who shared their approach to the world. Slytherin House, in its original conception, was not designed as an enclave of cruelty or supremacy. It was intended to cultivate leadership, ambition, and strategic thinking. Salazar believed that magical society needed planners as much as heroes, negotiators as much as scholars. His house was meant to produce witches and wizards who could navigate power structures quietly and effectively, ensuring stability behind the scenes. Ambition, in this context, was not equated with domination. It was defined as drive paired with patience. A Slytherin student was expected to see beyond immediate outcomes, to consider long-term consequences, and to pursue goals through adaptability rather than force. These traits mirrored Salazar's own magical philosophy, shaped by concealment and endurance rather than spectacle. The Sorting Hat itself reflects this nuanced origin. Enchanted collectively by the founders, it was imbued with their values and disagreements alike. While Salazar's influence ensured that lineage and cunning were considered, the hat was never programmed to exclude automatically. It evaluated potential, preference, and temperament, balancing competing priorities rather than enforcing a single ideology. Early Hogwarts records suggest that Slytherin House initially included a broader range of students than later centuries would imply. Blood purity was not yet codified doctrine. What mattered more was preparedness. Students who demonstrated discipline, restraint, and awareness of magical consequences were favoured. These qualities often correlated with magical upbringing, but they were not synonymous with it. As Hogwarts settled into routine, Slytherin House quickly distinguished itself as a training ground for governance. Its students gravitated toward roles involving coordination, strategy, and institutional continuity. They were often drawn to administrative magic, advanced charms, and long-term projects that required careful planning. While other houses produced visible champions, Slytherin students frequently operated behind the scenes. This dynamic complemented the broader Hogwarts ecosystem. Gryffindors took risks, Ravenclaws refined knowledge, Hufflepuff sustained community, Slytherins maintained structure. In its earliest years, the house system functioned less as competition and more as interdependence. Each house addressed a different vulnerability within magical society. The tensions between Salazar and the other founders did not negate this initial balance. Disagreements were frequent but functional. The school's survival depended on maintaining internal cohesion, even amid philosophical difference. For a time, that cohesion held. What would later be remembered as Slytherin exceptionalism was originally institutional responsibility. Salazar believed that power naturally accumulated somewhere, and that ignoring this reality invited chaos. His house was designed to engage with power directly, rather than pretend it could be dispersed evenly without consequence. It is important to note that early Slytherin students were not isolated from the rest of the school. They shared classes, meals, and communal spaces. House identity existed alongside a broader Hogwarts identity. The later insularity associated with Slytherin developed gradually, influenced by external pressures rather than initial design. In this early period, Hogwarts represented a fragile experiment. It balanced openness with caution, idealism with pragmatism. Slytherin House embodied the pragmatic end of that spectrum, offering a counterweight to optimism that Salazar feared could become recklessness. Understanding the original purpose of Slytherin House requires setting aside later outcomes. It was not built as a breeding ground for extremism, but as a stabilizing force within an unstable world. Its values were shaped by the belief that survival required foresight, discipline, and the willingness to make uncomfortable decisions. As centuries passed, the context that gave these values meaning would change. Safety increased, secrecy improved, threats evolved, but the structure remained, carrying forward assumptions born of a harsher era. The seeds planted at Hogwarts' founding would grow in ways the founders themselves could not fully control. In its original form, Slytherin House was neither villainous nor virtuous. It was necessary, shaped by fear and responsibility in equal measure. To understand its later reputation, one must first understand the role it was meant to play at the beginning. Over time, the philosophical differences among the founders grew heavier, no longer balanced solely by mutual respect or shared purpose. As Hogwarts matured, so too did the consequences of its decisions. Students arrived younger, stayed longer, and carried what they learned back into a world still deeply suspicious of magic. With every graduating class, the school's influence expanded beyond its walls, and with that expansion came greater risk. For Salazar Slytherin, this evolution sharpened his concerns rather than easing them. He observed not only who was being taught, but how that teaching manifested once students left Hogwarts. Acts of accidental magic, careless boasting, or poorly concealed spellwork could ripple outward, drawing attention not just to individuals, but to entire regions. In Salazar's mind, the margin for error was shrinking, not growing. The other founders interpreted the same developments differently. Godric Gryffindor saw students growing bolder and more capable, better able to defend themselves and others if confronted. Rowena Ravenclaw saw knowledge spreading, refinement increasing, and magical theory becoming safer through understanding. Helga Hufflepuff saw bonds forming across backgrounds, creating unity where fear once ruled. These were not abstract disagreements debated in calm isolation. They unfolded in real time, shaped by reports from beyond the castle, whispers of near exposures, and memories of persecution that were still fresh. Each founder weighed the same evidence and reached different conclusions. Salazar's position hardened into an ultimatum. He argued that Hogwarts had a responsibility not only to its students, but to every witch and wizard who depended on secrecy for survival. Admitting Muggle-born students, he believed, increased risk exponentially. It was not a judgment of worth or potential, but of preparedness. Without generations of cultural knowledge, he feared these students could not fully grasp the stakes. This stance placed him in direct opposition to Helga Hufflepuff, whose belief that magic imposed an obligation to teach all who possessed it was unwavering. To deny education, in her view, was to abandon children to ignorance and danger. Rowena Ravenclaw supported this position intellectually, believing that structured learning reduced chaos rather than inviting it. Godric Gryffindor supported it morally, convinced that courage and character mattered more than ancestry. The rift was not merely ideological, it became personal. Salazar felt outvoted, dismissed, and increasingly isolated within an institution he had helped create. His warnings, once debated seriously, began to feel to him like formalities rather than considerations. Trust eroded on all sides. It is within this period that the most controversial of Salazar's actions took shape. Anticipating a future in which his views would be entirely overridden, he acted unilaterally. Deep within Hogwarts, hidden from all but himself and those who shared his lineage, he constructed a final safeguard. The Chamber of Secrets was not conceived as an act of immediate violence. Its design was deliberate, secretive, and patient. Salazar did not unleash its contents during his lifetime. Instead, he bound its activation to conditions he believed would justify its use. Only an heir who shared his values, his abilities, and his judgment could access it. The basilisk housed within the chamber was not a weapon of convenience. It was a deterrent of last resort, intended to act only when Salazar's worst fears had been realized. Whether this justification holds is a matter of moral judgment, but the intent reveals his mindset: prevention through extreme contingency. Shortly after completing the chamber, Salazar Slytherin departed Hogwarts. The circumstances of his leaving were neither ceremonious nor violent. He did not destroy the school, nor did he attempt to claim it by force. He left behind arguments unresolved, trust broken, and a legacy divided. In his absence, the remaining founders closed ranks. Hogwarts endured. Over time, Salazar's position was recorded less as a warning born of fear, and more as a prejudice rooted in intolerance. As generations passed and conditions improved, his reasoning became increasingly difficult to defend. Yet the structures he helped build remained. Slytherin House continued to sort students who valued ambition, strategy, and self-preservation. The sorting hat preserved echoes of Salazar's voice, even as the school moved forward without him. The rift among the founders marked a turning point in Hogwarts' identity. From that moment on, the school carried an unresolved tension between openness and caution, idealism and pragmatism. Slytherin House embodied the latter, often at the cost of reputation. This moment, more than any other, defined how history would remember Salazar Slytherin. Not as a collaborator, but as a dissenter. Not as a founder, but as a warning. Yet history rarely remembers compromise. It remembers fracture. The Chamber of Secrets would sleep for centuries, its existence denied or forgotten, until a world very different from Salazar's would awaken it for reasons he never intended. With Salazar gone, Slytherin House entered a new phase, no longer guided by its founder's direct influence, but shaped by interpretation, inheritance, and the slow drift of ideology over time. What began as caution would, in some hands, become conviction. To understand what followed, it is necessary to trace Slytherin House beyond its origin, into the centuries where fear hardened into doctrine, and ambition detached from responsibility. The story of Slytherin did not end with its founder. In many ways, it was only beginning. In the centuries following Salazar Slytherin's departure, Slytherin House was left without the guiding presence of its founder, yet firmly bound to the framework he had helped construct. The values he instilled did not vanish with him. Instead, they entered a period of reinterpretation, shaped by new generations of students, shifting political climates, and a wizarding world that was slowly, unevenly becoming safer. Without Salazar to contextualize his philosophy, Slytherin ideals began to drift. What had once been a cautious response to genuine danger became, over time, an inherited worldview. Ambition, strategy, and self-preservation remained central, but the reasons for prioritizing them grew less explicit. Students absorbed the language of vigilance, without necessarily understanding the fear that had made it reasonable. As Hogwarts became an established institution rather than an experiment, magical education normalized. Children arrived expecting safety rather than secrecy. Graduates returned to communities protected by growing networks of concealment charms and informal agreements. Slowly, the conditions that had shaped Salazar's urgency began to fade. Yet institutional memory lags behind lived reality. Slytherin House continued to prize lineage, not because danger remained constant, but because lineage had become symbolic. Families who had endured persecution reframed survival as proof of inherent superiority. The distinction between preparedness and worth blurred, and in some cases disappeared entirely. This shift did not occur overnight, nor was it uniform. Many Slytherins continued to embody adaptability and restraint without embracing exclusion. Others, however, found certainty in simplified narratives. Blood became an identity marker rather than a logistical concern. Ambition detached from responsibility and turned inward. As wizarding governance expanded, Slytherin alumni gravitated naturally toward positions of influence. Their training in foresight and negotiation suited administrative roles. Councils, regulatory bodies, and advisory positions increasingly bore the imprint of Slytherin thought. This presence reinforced the perception that Slytherin sought control, even when their actions focused on continuity rather than dominance. Political power, once engaged defensively, began to attract those who valued authority for its own sake. In these hands, Slytherin principles hardened further. Strategy became manipulation. Caution became suspicion. The house's reputation began to shift, driven not by its entirety, but by its most visible representatives. The absence of Salazar's balancing intent mattered. While his views were restrictive, they were also bounded by responsibility. He believed power carried obligation. Later, interpreters inherited the structure, without the restraint. Ideology survived longer than context. During this period, wizarding history began to be recorded more deliberately. Chroniclers favoured clarity over nuance, stories simplified. Slytherin's internal diversity flattened into stereotype. The house became a convenient vessel for moral lessons, absorbing blame for broader societal failures. It is important to note that other houses evolved as well. Gryffindor valorized heroism more openly as threats diminished. Ravenclaw institutionalized knowledge. Hufflepuff formalized community. Slytherin alone struggled to redefine itself once fear ceased to be its primary organizing principle. As centuries passed, blood purity ideology spread beyond Hogwarts, feeding off political anxiety and social change. Families claiming descent from Salazar Slytherin weaponized his name, using it to legitimize exclusionary movements he never lived to endorse. The distance between founder intent and follower action widened dramatically. Slytherin House became entangled with these movements through association rather than inevitability. Students sorted into the house inherited expectations shaped by external narratives. Some resisted them, others conformed. The house's identity grew increasingly reactive, defined as much by accusation as by belief. Within Hogwarts, this evolution created tension. Professors attempted to counterbalance stereotypes, but house identity exerted powerful influence during formative years. Students learned not only from curriculum, but from reputation. Self-fulfilling cycles took hold. By the late medieval period, Slytherin House had become both influential and isolated. Its members occupied key positions while remaining socially suspect. This duality reinforced defensiveness, which in turn deepened mistrust. None of this was inevitable. It was the result of accumulated interpretation, selective memory, and the slow erosion of context. What began as a survival strategy had become a tradition struggling to justify itself. Understanding this evolution is essential. It reveals that Slytherin's later reputation was not the product of a single founder's malice, but of centuries of unexamined inheritance. Values persisted after their purpose faded, reshaped by fear long after fear was no longer the dominant force. Slytherin House did not simply fall from grace, it drifted, carried forward by momentum, misremembered history, and the human tendency to cling to certainty in uncertain times. As wizarding society continued to formalise, fear did not vanish so much as it changed shape. External persecution diminished gradually, replaced by internal anxieties about identity, influence, and control. In this new environment, the language of blood purity offered a simple framework through which uncertainty could be explained and managed. For some, it promised continuity in a world that felt increasingly diffuse. Slytherin House became closely associated with this framework, not because it originated there in its later form, but because it provided fertile ground for its articulation. The house's emphasis on lineage, ambition, and strategy made it an attractive banner under which ideological movements could gather. What had once been caution became justification. Families who traced or claimed descent from Salazar Slytherin elevated ancestry into ideology. Over generations, stories hardened into doctrine. Survival became proof. Endurance became entitlement. The distinction between being prepared and being deserving collapsed under repetition. Political institutions reflected this shift. As councils and governing bodies expanded, debates over magical law increasingly centred on who should wield authority. Slytherin-aligned figures often argued for regulation, oversight, and hierarchy, framing these as safeguards rather than domination. Their critics heard exclusion, where Slytherins heard order. These disagreements intensified during periods of instability. Economic strain, magical accidents, and social change revived anxieties about exposure and loss of control. In such moments, simplified narratives gained traction. Blood purity promised clarity where nuance felt dangerous. Importantly, this ideology did not encompass all Slytherins, nor was it universally embraced within the house. Many students and alumni rejected its extremes while still valuing ambition and foresight. However, public discourse rarely distinguishes between internal diversity and visible leadership. The loudest voices define the narrative. The association between Slytherin House and dark magic deepened during this period, though not always accurately. Ambitious witches and wizards were more likely to pursue advanced or restricted forms of magic, not out of malice, but out of curiosity and utility. These pursuits, often misunderstood, reinforced suspicion. Meanwhile, dark wizards from other houses faded from collective memory or were reframed as anomalies. Slytherin, by contrast, became shorthand. Complexity was replaced with pattern. Pattern hardened into assumption. The Ministry of Magic, once established, institutionalized these perceptions. Regulatory scrutiny disproportionately targeted practices associated with Slytherin traditions, further isolating the house's alumni. This scrutiny, intended to curb excess, often strengthened defensive postures instead. Within Hogwarts, these dynamics shaped student experience. Young Slytherins arrived already burdened by expectation, praised or condemned before speaking a word. Some leaned into the role assigned to them. Others resisted quietly. Few escaped it entirely. The The house's reputation fed back into itself. Suspicion bred secrecy. Secrecy bred rumour. Rumour justified further suspicion. Over time, the line between external accusation and internal identity blurred. Yet even amid this drift, Slytherin continued to produce figures who stabilised institutions, brokered peace, and maintained continuity during crisis. Their contributions rarely attracted legend. History prefers spectacle. This imbalance of memory shaped how future generations understood the house. Slytherin became a repository for collective anxiety, a place to locate discomfort without examining its source. The house bore the weight of fears the wider society refused to confront. Blood purity, in its most extreme form, was not a Slytherin invention. It was a societal pathology that found expression through Slytherin symbols. The house did not create the disease, it provided the language. Recognizing this distinction matters. It allows for accountability without erasure. It acknowledges harm without flattening identity. It restores agency to individuals rather than condemning lineage. By the time modern wizarding history begins to take shape, Slytherin House stands at a crossroads. Its values remain potent, but their meaning is contested. Ambition can still serve progress. Strategy can still prevent catastrophe. The question is not whether Slytherin traits are dangerous, but whether they are guided. This unresolved tension sets the stage for the era most familiar to contemporary audiences, where Slytherin's reputation collides directly with lived experience, and where the house's legacy is tested not by myth, but by choice. By the time Hogwarts entered the modern era, Slytherin House existed beneath a weight of expectation that few of its students had any hand in creating. Centuries of interpretation had condensed its identity into a set of assumptions that greeted children before they ever set foot in the castle. Sorting into Slytherin no longer felt like a neutral placement. It felt to many like a verdict. For first-year students, this burden manifested quickly. Classmates watched them more closely. Professors, often unconsciously, held them to different standards. Even casual interactions carried an undercurrent of suspicion or defensiveness. In this environment, Slytherin identity became something to manage rather than simply inhabit. Some students responded by leaning into expectation. If ambition and cunning were assumed, they reasoned, then there was little incentive to appear otherwise. This response was not innate malice, but adaptation. When a role is assigned persistently, resisting it requires energy many adolescents do not yet possess. Others responded with quiet withdrawal. They kept their goals private, avoided drawing attention, and learned to succeed without visibility. These students embodied the more restrained aspects of Slytherin tradition, but their stories rarely entered collective memory. Silence does not create legend. Within the common room, Slytherin culture was more nuanced than outsiders imagined. Competition existed, but so did mentorship. Older students guided younger ones through the complexities of reputation management, academic pressure, and strategic thinking. Loyalty, though expressed differently than in other houses, was present and often deeply ingrained. Ambition among modern Slytherins took many forms. Some sought political power, others academic mastery, others personal security. The common thread was intentionality. Slytherins tended to plan, to think several steps ahead, and to consider consequence alongside desire. The late 20th century, however, placed extraordinary strain on these dynamics. The rise of Lord Voldemort, himself a Slytherin alumnus, cast a long shadow over the house. His actions retroactively coloured every ambition with suspicion, every act of self-interest with fear. Students sorted into Slytherin during this period inherited not only a damaged reputation, but an active association with terror. The distinction between individual choice and historical legacy collapsed in public perception. Guilt became assumed rather than demonstrated. Within Hogwarts, this created a fracturing effect. Some Slytherins were drawn toward the ideology Voldemort represented, seeing in it validation of narratives they had absorbed since childhood. Others rejected it entirely, repulsed by the extremity it revealed. The house did not move as one. It fractured along lines of belief, family influence, and personal experience. Yet external observers rarely acknowledged this division. Slytherin was spoken of as a monolith, despite clear internal disagreement. During this era, the Sorting Hat itself showed signs of conflict. Its insistence on choice, on listening to student preference, became more pronounced. Ambition, without cruelty, resourcefulness without exclusion, began to find space within Slytherin despite the surrounding pressure. It is notable that many Slytherins who rejected Voldemort's ideology did so quietly. Public resistance was dangerous. Silence once again became survival. This pattern mirrored the house's earliest origins more closely than its critics realised. After the Second Wizarding War, the wizarding world faced a reckoning. Institutions examined their failures. Narratives were challenged. Slytherin House, long defined by association, began to be reassessed. Younger generations entered Hogwarts with greater historical awareness and a willingness to question inherited assumptions. Professors adjusted their expectations. Inter-house relationships softened, if unevenly. Slytherin did not suddenly transform. Change was incremental, but space opened for ambition, guided by ethics, for strategy, aligned with community rather than dominance. In this modern context, Slytherin's true legacy becomes clearer. It is not a house of villains, nor a misunderstood martyr. It is a house that has always grappled with power and consequence, often clumsily, sometimes harmfully, but not inevitably. The question Slytherin poses to the wizarding world is not whether ambition corrupts, but whether ambition is examined. Left unchecked, it hardens. Guided thoughtfully, it stabilizes. This tension, unresolved and ongoing, defines Slytherin more honestly than any slogan or stereotype. It is a house shaped by history, burdened by memory, and still capable of choice. As the wizarding world continues to evolve, Slytherin's story remains unfinished. Its past offers warning. Its present offers possibility. Its future depends not on lineage, but on reflection. And it is here, in this space between reputation and reality, that Slytherin's true history settles, not as a verdict, but as an invitation to look closer. When historians attempt to summarize Slytherin House, they often default to moral shorthand. Ambition becomes greed. Strategy becomes manipulation. Caution becomes cruelty. These reductions are tidy, memorable, and ultimately misleading. They reveal more about how societies prefer to remember their past than about the past itself. Slytherin's legacy is difficult precisely because it resists simplicity. It exists at the intersection of power and restraint, fear and foresight, choice and inheritance. The house has always attracted those willing to think beyond immediate reward, to consider outcomes that unfold slowly, quietly, and sometimes uncomfortably. This orientation toward the long view has made Slytherins indispensable during periods of stability and deeply suspect during periods of moral panic. When institutions function smoothly, strategic minds are praised. When those same institutions fail, strategy is recast as conspiracy. The wizarding world's discomfort with Slytherin often mirrors its discomfort with power itself. Power is necessary to govern, to defend, to organise, yet it is also capable of harm. Slytherin House, more than any other, forces this contradiction into the open. Other houses externalise their risks. Gryffindor's courage can become recklessness. Ravenclaw's intellect can become detachment. Hufflepuff's loyalty can become complacency. Slytherin's risks are less visible, but more unsettling. They operate beneath the surface, shaping outcomes without spectacle. This invisibility has made Slytherin easy to fear. What cannot be easily seen or celebrated is often mistrusted. Over time, mistrust calcifies into myth. Yet myth obscures agency. It strips individuals of choice by assigning them predetermined roles. One of the most enduring harms done to Slytherin House is the assumption that sorting determines destiny. History repeatedly contradicts this belief, but repetition gives it power. The truth is that Slytherin has never been about inevitability. It has always been about decision-making under constraint. Its students are not defined by what they're born into, but by how they navigate opportunity, pressure, and responsibility. When Slytherins fail, they often fail quietly, incrementally, through rationalizations that seem harmless in isolation. When they succeed, they often do so without applause, stabilizing systems that few notice until they collapse. This asymmetry shapes memory. Catastrophe is remembered. Maintenance is forgotten. In reassessing Slytherin's history, it becomes clear that the house has functioned as a mirror. It reflects the wizarding world's evolving relationship with authority, security, and fear. When society prioritizes control, Slytherin is praised. When society prioritizes openness, Slytherin is condemned. Neither response captures the full picture. The house is neither a villain nor a victim. It is a tool set. Like all tools, it can be used constructively or destructively, depending on who wields it and why. This framing restores moral responsibility where it belongs, with individuals and institutions, not with symbols. Salazar Slytherin's greatest error was not ambition, but inflexibility. His successors' greatest errors came from mistaking tradition for truth. Yet within that same lineage exist countless counterexamples. Slytherins who chose restraint over dominance, who valued continuity over conquest, who understood that power without accountability corrodes from within. These stories are quieter, but they endure. They are embedded in the everyday functioning of magical society, in laws that hold, treaties that last, and systems that adapt rather than fracture. To tell Slytherin's true history is not to rehabilitate its image, but to complicate it. Complexity is not comfort. It demands attention, nuance, and the willingness to sit with contradiction. In that sense, Slytherin House remains what it has always been, a challenge, not just to the wizarding world, but to anyone who would prefer their history simple and their villains obvious. The legacy of Slytherin does not ask to be forgiven, it asks to be understood. And understanding, unlike myth, has room for growth. If you've enjoyed this slow, in-depth exploration of the wizarding world's most misunderstood house, consider liking the video and subscribing to Restricted Section Lore. New long-form, sleep-friendly deep dives into Harry Potter lore are released regularly, designed for relaxation, reflection, and quiet curiosity. Settle in, let the story linger, and I'll see you in the next chapter of the Wizarding World. To deepen this understanding, it is worth returning again to the earlier centuries of Hogwarts operation, not to repeat what has already been said, but to look more closely at how Slytherin values express themselves in everyday magical life. Records from this period, sparse and uneven as they are, suggest that Slytherin-aligned witches and wizards often occupied roles that demanded patience rather than glory. They were mediators in disputes between magical families, overseers of land wards, and custodians of spells whose purpose was not to dazzle but to endure. These individuals rarely attracted attention precisely because their work succeeded. A ward that held did not become legend. A negotiation that prevented violence did not inspire song. In this way, Slytherin contribution became invisible by design, reinforcing the later illusion that the house produced little beyond ambition and intrigue. In rural communities especially, Slytherin-trained witches and wizards were often tasked with maintaining concealment charms that protected entire villages. These spells required constant adjustment, subtle recalibration, and an intimate understanding of both magical and non-magical patterns of behaviour. Such work rewarded foresight and punished impulsivity. It suited Slytherin temperament well. As the Statute of Secrecy approached, these practices became increasingly standardised. The skills honed quietly within Slytherin House translated naturally into bureaucratic and regulatory frameworks. What had once been instinctive caution evolved into policy. This transition further distanced Slytherin from popular imagination. Bureaucracy rarely inspires affection. Rules are remembered when they restrict, not when they protect. As magical lore expanded, resentment followed, and Slytherin influence became an easy target for that resentment. At the same time, ambition within Slytherin House diversified. While some pursued political authority, others sought mastery of obscure magical disciplines. Potion making, ward theory, and enchantment layering attracted students who preferred systems to spectacle. These fields demanded long-term commitment and accepted delayed reward, qualities reinforced within Slytherin culture. It is no coincidence that many foundational magical texts on containment, preservation, and magical ethics are attributed to witches and wizards sorted into Slytherin. Their writing style is often dry, methodical, and precise. It lacks the flourish of heroic accounts, but it underpins much of modern magical practice. As centuries progressed, however, this intellectual tradition competed with a louder narrative. Political extremism, when it emerged, drew disproportionate attention. Extremists spoke in absolutes, moderates spoke in caveats. History, hungry for clarity, chose the former. This pattern intensified during periods of crisis. When fear rose, nuance fell away. The public sought figures to blame and symbols to fear. Slytherin House, already burdened by reputation, provided both. It is tempting, in retrospect, to treat this outcome as inevitable. It was not. It emerged from repeated choices to simplify, to generalize, and to externalize responsibility. Each generation inherited a narrative slightly more rigid than the last. Within Hogwarts itself, these narratives shaped pedagogy. Certain professors overcorrected, scrutinizing Slytherins more harshly in an attempt to prevent future harm. Others disengaged, assuming efforts were futile. Both approaches reinforced alienation. Yet within this pressure, Slytherin House continued to adapt. Students learned to navigate scrutiny with care. They refined their ability to read social environments, to anticipate response, and to choose silence strategically. These skills, while born of constraint, were not without value. In adulthood, many former Slytherins carried this adaptive caution into their professions. They avoided public controversy, preferred incremental reform, and understood that timing often mattered more than intention. Their influence was subtle, cumulative, and difficult to trace. This subtlety complicates historical accounting. How does one measure the impact of crises that never occurred? Conflicts quietly diffused, or laws crafted carefully enough to endure? Such achievements resist narrative compression. When Slytherin is remembered primarily through its worst examples, these quieter contributions disappear. The house becomes synonymous with ambition, divorced from ethics, rather than ambition disciplined by consequence. Reintroducing these missing layers does not excuse harm committed in Slytherin's name. It contextualizes it. It restores proportion. The Wizarding World's relationship with Slytherin thus reflects a broader human pattern: the tendency to remember disruption more vividly than stability, transgression more readily than restraint. As this pattern continues to be examined, the meaning of Slytherin shifts again, not toward absolution, but toward responsibility shared. The house's history becomes a case study rather than a cautionary tale, and in that shift, Slytherin House regains something it had gradually lost: the possibility of being understood on its own terms, rather than as a shadow cast by its most infamous alumnus. Another layer of Slytherin's history emerges when examining how the house interacted with the broader institutional fabric of the wizarding world beyond Hogwarts. While Gryffindor alumni often became auras and Ravenclaws gravitated toward academia, Slytherins frequently occupied the less visible connective tissue of governance. They served as liaisons between departments, advisors whose names rarely appeared in headlines, and architects of procedures designed to function quietly under strain. These roles demanded a tolerance for ambiguity. Decisions were rarely clear-cut. Trade-offs were inevitable. Slytherin-trained witches and wizards learned to operate within these grey spaces, balancing competing interests while minimising fallout. This aptitude did not always endear them to the public, which tends to prefer decisive narratives over negotiated outcomes. Within the Ministry of Magic, this dynamic became particularly pronounced. Policy debates often split along philosophical lines that mirrored the founding houses. Slytherin voices argued for caution, phased implementation, and contingency planning. Their proposals were frequently unpopular in moments of optimism, only to be revisited after crises exposed unanticipated weaknesses. This pattern reinforced a perception that Slytherins thrived on restriction. In reality, many sought durability. Laws written too boldly risked collapse. Regulations crafted with foresight could persist quietly for generations. The latter rarely inspired admiration. Inter-house tension at Hogwarts reflected these broader societal roles. Gryffindor students sometimes perceived Slytherins as calculating or evasive. Slytherins, in turn, often viewed Gryffindor impulsiveness as destabilizing. These perceptions were reinforced by house narratives passed down year after year, shaping expectation before experience. Ravenclaw students frequently found common ground with Slytherins in academic settings, particularly in advanced magical theory. Both houses valued preparation and precision, though their motivations differed. Ravenclaws pursued understanding for its own sake. Slytherins pursued understanding as a means of control over outcome. Hufflepuff relationships with Slytherin were perhaps the most quietly complex. Where Hufflepuff emphasized inclusion and steady effort, Slytherin emphasized selectivity and leverage. In cooperative contexts, these differences complemented one another. In ideological debates, they clashed sharply. These inter-house dynamics mattered because they shaped how Slytherins learned to see themselves. Constant comparison sharpened self-awareness. Students became acutely conscious of how their actions might be interpreted, often adjusting behaviour preemptively. Over time, this reflexive self-monitoring became a hallmark of Slytherin identity. It produced both strengths and vulnerabilities. The ability to anticipate response fostered adaptability. The habit of concealment, however, sometimes impeded trust. This tendency toward guardedness fed into broader narratives about secrecy. Observers mistook discretion for duplicity. Silence was interpreted as scheming rather than caution. The distinction between the two blurred in public imagination. Yet silence often functioned as self-protection. In an environment where suspicion lingered, transparency could invite misinterpretation. Many Slytherins learned early that explanation did not always produce understanding. As a result, the house developed a culture that prized internal clarity over external approval. Validation came from achieving intended outcomes, not from public praise. This orientation reinforced resilience, but widened social distance. When crises struck the wizarding world, these dynamics intensified. During wars and political upheaval, Slytherin influence was scrutinized heavily. Any alignment with authority was suspect. Any call for order was read as authoritarian. At the same time, Slytherin contributions during these periods often went unrecorded. Emergency protocols, evacuation wards, and resource allocation plans bore their imprint, but attribution was diffuse. Success was collective. Blame was individual. This asymmetry shaped post-crisis memory. Failures were personalized. Stabilization was anonymized. Slytherin's reputation suffered accordingly. Understanding this pattern clarifies why the house's history feels weighted toward darkness, despite its consistent involvement in preservation. The archive remembers disruption more readily than repair. To restore balance to that record requires patience. It requires tracing outcomes backward through systems rather than forward from personalities. It requires acknowledging that the most consequential magic, often leaves the faintest trace. In this light, Slytherin House appears not as an aberration, but as an integral, if uncomfortable, component of wizarding society. It specializes in the work few wish to claim, and many are quick to condemn. This specialization carries risk. When ambition eclipses accountability, harm follows. When caution becomes exclusion, injustice hardens. Slytherin's history includes both failures and safeguards. What distinguishes the house is not purity or corruption, but proximity to power. And power, by its nature, amplifies consequence. To engage honestly with Slytherin's past is to confront the costs of governance itself. The house's story is not separate from the wizarding world's history. It is embedded within it, shaping outcomes quietly, persistently, and often without recognition. Fear has always played a central role in how societies remember their past, and the wizarding world is no exception. When danger recedes, memory does not relax with it. Instead, fear searches for a new shape, often settling into stories that explain why catastrophe once felt close and why it might return. Slytherin House, positioned historically near power and precaution, became a convenient vessel for these anxieties. as generations passed without widespread persecution, the original reasons for caution blurred. What remained was a cultural reflex. People remembered that restraint had once been necessary, but not why. Into that gap stepped myth, filling uncertainty with moral certainty. In these retellings, Slytherin transformed from a house that planned for worst-case scenarios into one that desired them. Preparation was recast as anticipation. Strategy became conspiracy. The distinction between preventing harm and profiting from it collapsed in popular imagination. This process was not unique to Slytherin. Across history, groups associated with authority are often remembered less for what they prevented than for what they controlled. Power invites projection. Those who wield it become symbols onto which fear is mapped. The wizarding world's discomfort with dark magic further intensified this dynamic. Advanced magic, by its nature, requires restraint and ethical boundary setting. Slytherin students, drawn to mastery and consequence, often explored these boundaries carefully. Observers, lacking visibility into intent, conflated proximity with endorsement. As a result, the phrase "dark wizard" gradually narrowed in meaning. It ceased to describe actions and began to describe affiliations. House identity became shorthand for moral trajectory. This shift did immense harm, flattening individual choice into expectation. Children sorted into Slytherin inherited centuries of unresolved fear. They learned quickly that missteps would be interpreted as confirmation rather than mistake. This pressure shaped behavior, subtly but persistently. Psychologically, such an environment fosters hypervigilance. Students monitor themselves constantly, anticipating judgment. Some internalize suspicion and respond defensively. Others disengage emotionally, retreating into detachment as protection. Neither response reflects inherent disposition. Both are adaptations to scrutiny. Over time, these adaptations reinforce the very traits critics feared. Guardedness looked like secrecy. Strategic silence looked like manipulation. The feedback loop closed. Breaking this cycle required more than time. It required deliberate narrative correction, something wizarding society was slow to attempt. Comfort lay in familiar stories. Revising them meant confronting collective complicity. Even after the Second Wizarding War, when institutional reflection became unavoidable, progress was uneven. Some voices called for re-evaluating house identity altogether. Others insisted tradition must remain untouched. Slytherin once again stood at the centre of the debate. In this moment, the house's internal diversity became more visible. Former students spoke openly about experiences that contradicted stereotype. Educators adjusted how they framed ambition and leadership. Small shifts accumulated. These changes did not erase the past, nor should they. They contextualized it. They acknowledged that harm had occurred without declaring it inevitable. Understanding the psychological burden carried by Slytherin students reframes many historical behaviours. Actions once interpreted as evidence of moral failing appear instead as survival strategies within a hostile narrative environment. This does not absolve wrongdoing. Accountability remains essential, but accountability loses meaning when applied indiscriminately. Slytherin's story demonstrates how identity hardens when fear is left unexamined. It shows how institutions can unintentionally reproduce the very behaviours they seek to prevent by assuming them in advance. The lesson here extends beyond one house. It speaks to how societies shape individuals through expectation, how labels can become scripts, and how history can trap the present if left unquestioned. In recognizing this pattern, the wizarding world gains an opportunity not to rewrite its past, but to read it more honestly. Slytherin House, long burdened by symbol and story, emerges not as a singular moral failure, but as a case study in what happens when fear outlives its cause. And in that recognition, the house's true history becomes less about condemnation and more about responsibility shared between founders and followers, institutions and individuals, memory and choice. Looking more closely at the rhythms of daily life within Slytherin House reveals another dimension often overlooked in grand historical summaries. Beyond ideology and reputation, there existed routines, expectations, and quiet cultural norms that shaped how students learned to see the world. These patterns, repeated year after year, carried as much influence as any public narrative. Evenings in the Slytherin common room were rarely loud. Conversation tended toward the low and deliberate. Students discussed coursework, future plans, and interpersonal dynamics with an eye toward outcome rather than expression. There was value placed on listening more than speaking, on gathering information before committing to opinion. This environment rewarded patience. Younger students learned quickly that impulsivity drew scrutiny, while composure earned trust. Older students modelled restraint not through overt instruction, but through example. Advice was given selectively, often framed as suggestion rather than command. Such norms contrasted sharply with perceptions held by outsiders. Silence was mistaken for secrecy. Calculation was mistaken for cruelty. Yet within the house, these behaviours were understood as respect for consequence. Competition existed, but it was structured differently than in other houses. Success was measured not only by immediate achievement, but by sustainability. A victory that attracted unwanted attention was often regarded as a liability rather than a triumph. This approach influenced academic behaviour. Slytherin students often excelled in subjects requiring layered understanding: potions, advanced charms, magical theory. These disciplines rewarded precision, timing, and the ability to anticipate reaction. Failure within Slytherin was treated pragmatically. Mistakes were analysed privately. Public displays of error were avoided, not out of shame, but out of awareness that reputation once damaged was difficult to repair. This internal culture fostered resilience, but also isolation. Students learned to rely on a small network of trusted peers rather than broad approval. Loyalty, while understated, ran deep. When conflicts arose, they were often resolved quietly. Direct confrontation was rare unless unavoidable. Mediation was preferred to escalation. These habits mirrored the house's broader historical role within wizarding society. Over time, this internal coherence became both strength and vulnerability. It allowed Slytherins to endure external suspicion without fracturing, but it also reinforced perceptions of insularity. The cumulative effect of these daily practices was subtle but powerful. Graduates left Hogwarts equipped not only with magical skill, but with a particular way of engaging the world. Observe first, act second, reveal intention last. In peaceful eras, this orientation proved invaluable. In turbulent times, it became suspect. Once again, context determined interpretation. Understanding these lived details complicates the image of Slytherin House. It shifts focus from abstract traits to concrete behaviours shaped by environment and expectation. It also reveals how easily misinterpretation arises when internal norms are judged externally without context. What feels protective from within can appear evasive from without. This disconnect between intention and perception echoes throughout Slytherin's history. It is present in policy debates, student interactions, and historical memory alike. Recognizing it does not resolve tension, but it clarifies it. It shows that Slytherin's story is not one of hidden villainy, but of persistent misunderstanding compounded over time. These misunderstandings did not remain static. They evolved alongside the wizarding world, adapting to new fears and new narratives, always finding resonance in the same familiar symbols. As the cycle continued, Slytherin House remained what it had always been, a space where consequence mattered, where foresight was prized, and where the cost of visibility was never forgotten. In these quiet, repeated moments, the conversations, the choices, the silences, the true texture of Slytherin history can be felt more clearly than in any legend or accusation. Across different eras, Slytherin House has produced recurring archetypes that help illuminate how ambition expresses itself without collapsing into caricature. These archetypes are not rigid categories, but patterns that appear again and again when individuals with similar pressures and values navigate a changing world. One such archetype is the steward. These Slytherins are drawn to roles that require maintenance rather than conquest. They oversee systems, preserve traditions, and ensure continuity across generations. Their ambition lies not in visibility, but in longevity. They are most satisfied when structures endure quietly after their involvement has ended. Another recurring figure is the negotiator. Skilled at reading competing interests, these individuals specialize in compromise that does not feel like capitulation. They understand leverage intuitively and use it to reduce conflict rather than inflame it. Their successes are often invisible, marked by crises that never escalate. There is also the reformer, a less frequently acknowledged but deeply significant archetype. Reformers within Slytherin recognize when inherited systems no longer serve their purpose. They work incrementally, altering frameworks from within rather than dismantling them publicly. This approach can appear conservative, but it often achieves lasting change. Of course, Slytherin history also includes the Dominator, the archetype most often remembered. These individuals pursue power as an end rather than a means. They mistake control for security and authority for legitimacy. When unchallenged, their actions cause genuine harm. What is frequently overlooked is that these archetypes coexist within the same house, sometimes within the same individual, across different stages of life. Ambition is not static. It evolves with context, opportunity, and consequence. In early adulthood, ambition may express as self-protection. Later, it may transform into responsibility for others. In some cases, it calcifies into entitlement. The house does not dictate this trajectory. Circumstance and choice do. Understanding these archetypes clarifies why Slytherin's reputation skews so heavily toward its worst examples. Dominators disrupt systems dramatically, leaving scars that demand explanation. Stewards and negotiators prevent disruption, leaving little trace. History gravitates toward rupture. It records moments of collapse more readily than decades of stability. Slytherin's archetypal imbalance in memory reflects this bias. The Reformers' work, in particular, resists myth. Gradual change lacks spectacle. It requires patience from both actor and observer. In a culture that values decisive action, incremental progress appears passive. Yet many of the wizarding world's most enduring institutions owe their survival to such quiet reform. Laws adjusted rather than overturned, practices refined rather than abolished. These contributions rarely bear the Slytherin name explicitly, but their influence persists. Recognizing this diversity of ambition reframes Slytherin House as a spectrum rather than a singular moral identity. It challenges the assumption that desire for influence inevitably leads to domination. This reframing also restores agency. If ambition can manifest in multiple forms, then individuals are not bound to a single outcome. Choice regains significance. The tragedy of Slytherin's history lies not in its values, but in how often those values were interpreted without accountability. Ambition without reflection becomes corrosive. Strategy without ethics becomes manipulation. Foresight without empathy becomes exclusion. These failures are not unique to Slytherin. They are failures of power wherever it concentrates. Slytherin's proximity to power simply makes them more visible. Understanding this does not dilute responsibility, it sharpens it. It places moral weight back onto decisions rather than symbols. When Slytherin House is viewed through the lens of archetype rather than stereotype, its history becomes legible. Patterns replace accusations. Explanation replaces assumption. In this light, Slytherin's true history is revealed not as a caution against ambition, but as a study in how ambition must be guided if it is to serve more than itself. The house does not ask to be feared or forgiven. It asks to be understood in full, with all the discomfort that understanding requires. Education within Slytherin House has always carried an undercurrent of ethical tension, though it's rarely described in those terms. Lessons were not limited to spell work or theory. Students absorbed a parallel curriculum concerned with consequence, leverage, and restraint. This learning was informal, transmitted through example, correction, and observation rather than explicit doctrine. When Slytherin students debated ideas, the conversation often turned toward outcomes rather than ideals. A proposed course of action was examined not only for its moral appeal, but for its durability. Would it hold under pressure? Would it provoke retaliation? Would it expose vulnerabilities elsewhere? These questions shaped how ambition was refined into strategy. This emphasis distinguished Slytherin education from that of other houses. Where Gryffindor rewarded decisive action, Slytherin emphasized timing. Where Ravenclaw pursued understanding, Slytherin focused on application. Where Hufflepuff stressed fairness, Slytherin examined enforceability. None of these approaches were inherently superior. Each addressed a different dimension of magical life. Conflict arose not because one house was wrong, but because their priorities diverged. Within Slytherin, ethics were often framed pragmatically rather than idealistically. Students were encouraged to ask not only whether something was right, but whether it would remain right once consequences unfolded. This framing could appear cold from the outside, yet it reflected an insistence on accountability beyond intention. However, this approach carried risk. When ethics are framed solely through outcome, moral boundaries can erode. Without deliberate reflection, effectiveness begins to outweigh empathy. History shows that Slytherin House struggled most when this balance was lost. Periods of institutional failure often coincided with moments when ambition went unexamined. Success bred confidence, confidence hardened into certainty, certainty invited excess. In contrast, eras of stability frequently aligned with moments when Slytherin influence was tempered by collaboration. When strategy operated alongside courage, wisdom, and loyalty, the wizarding world benefited from balance. This interplay was visible even in classroom dynamics. Group projects revealed differences in approach. Slytherins often assumed coordination roles, delegating tasks and anticipating obstacles. Others interpreted this as control. Slytherins saw it as responsibility. These misunderstandings rarely resolved themselves. They accumulated quietly, reinforcing house narratives without ever being openly addressed. Over time, the sorting hat itself adapted subtly. Accounts suggest it became more attentive to student intent, listening closely to how individuals understood ambition. Preference mattered more. Nuance mattered more. The hat did not abandon Slytherin values. It refined how they were interpreted. This evolution reflected a broader pedagogical shift within Hogwarts. Educators recognized that traits without guidance could become liabilities. Ambition required ethical framing. Strategy required accountability. Power required reflection. Slytherin students who thrived in this environment were those who learned to interrogate their own motives. They questioned why they wanted influence and how they intended to use it. This self-scrutiny distinguished leadership from domination. Those who resisted such reflection often struggled later. Without internal limits, external limits arrived harshly. History records these outcomes vividly, further skewing perception. Yet the quieter successes endured. Graduates who internalized ethical strategy contributed to resilient institutions, adaptive governance, and long-term peace. Their legacy persisted without fanfare. This pattern reinforces a central truth about Slytherin House. Its values are not inherently corruptive. They are amplifiers. They magnify intention, for good or ill. Understanding this reframes the role of education itself. Hogwarts does not merely sort traits, it shapes how those traits mature. Slytherin's history illustrates what happens when guidance falters and what is possible when it holds. In this sense, Slytherin House serves as both warning and potential. It demonstrates the necessity of pairing ambition with ethics, foresight with empathy, and strategy with responsibility. The wizarding world's ongoing challenge is not to suppress Slytherin qualities, but to cultivate them wisely. Only then can ambition become stewardship rather than domination, and power becomes service rather than threat. Over generations, the experience of being sorted into Slytherin House has shifted in subtle but important ways. While the core traits remained recognizable, the meaning attached to them evolved alongside the wizarding world itself. What it meant to be ambitious in one century was not identical to what it meant in another. Context reshaped interpretation. In earlier eras, ambition within Slytherin often aligned with survival. Securing land protections, negotiating alliances, or ensuring family continuity were legitimate goals in an uncertain world. As magical society stabilized, ambition increasingly turned inward, focusing on influence within established institutions rather than protection against external threat. This transition altered how Slytherin students understood themselves. Earlier generations saw ambition as a collective responsibility. Later generations were encouraged, implicitly or explicitly, to pursue individual advancement. This shift mirrored broader societal changes and was not unique to Slytherin, but its effects were magnified there. With this change came a growing tension between legacy and self-definition. Some students felt pressure to live up to family expectations tied to Slytherin reputation. Others resisted those narratives, attempting to redefine what ambition meant on their own terms. The Sorting Hat played a quiet role in mediating this tension. Accounts suggest it increasingly emphasised dialogue with students, weighing not only aptitude, but intention. A desire for influence was not disqualifying. An inability to reflect on that desire often was. This emphasis helped redirect many students whose ambitions were still forming. Slytherin House became less about predetermined destiny and more about potential shaped by choice. While stereotypes persisted externally, internal identity grew more flexible. Across generations, Slytherin alumni often spoke of a moment, sometimes years after graduation, when their understanding of ambition changed. Goals once pursued for status gave way to goals centred on responsibility. This maturation process was uneven but common. Such shifts rarely attract historical attention. They occur privately, within careers and families, rather than on battlefields or council floors. Yet they represent one of Slytherin's most consistent patterns, ambition evolving into stewardship. This evolution complicates the idea that Slytherin traits inevitably harden into cruelty. On the contrary, many individuals soften with experience, learning that power without trust is brittle. The persistence of negative reputation, despite this maturation, highlights the lag between lived reality and collective memory. Stories ossify even as people change. Within Hogwarts, educators increasingly recognise this gap. Efforts to encourage inter-house collaboration expanded. Group projects and shared responsibilities challenged inherited assumptions. These initiatives did not erase division, but they created space for nuance. Students encountered one another as individuals rather than archetypes. Slytherin students, in particular, benefited from contexts that allowed ambition to express itself openly, without suspicion. Leadership roles, framed as service rather than dominance, provided alternative narratives. This reframing did not dilute Slytherin identity, it strengthened it. Ambition, anchored in purpose, proved more sustainable than ambition driven by fear or comparison. Over time, these incremental changes began to ripple outward. Alumni carried revised understandings of power into their professions. Institutions adjusted gradually. None of this occurred dramatically. There were no proclamations, no sweeping reforms. Progress emerged through repetition, mentorship, and example. This slow pace frustrates those who seek visible transformation, yet it aligns with Slytherin's historical rhythm. Change that endures is rarely loud. In observing these generational shifts, Slytherin's history becomes less a straight line and more a series of adaptations. Traits persist, but their expression responds to environment. This adaptability may be Slytherin's most enduring contribution, the ability to revise ambition without abandoning it, to seek influence without clinging to domination. Understanding this adaptive arc restores complexity to the house's story. It shows that Slytherin is not frozen in its past, but continuously negotiating its future. And in that ongoing negotiation, the house reveals its truest characteristic. Not ambition alone, but the willingness to reshape ambition as circumstances demand. As we approach the end of this story, you may find yourself dozing off to sleep, or becoming dreary-eyed, or maybe you're already asleep. In either case, it is time for me to fade away and let the dreams take it from here. Have a good night and enjoy some crackles from the fireplace to help you drift further into your deep slumber.